The date was January 14th, 1983. West Hollywood, Los Angeles. Outside, Sunset Boulevard was doing what it always did, moving fast, loud, indifferent. But inside Meridian Keys and Strings on La Cienega Boulevard, the air moved differently. You smelled it before you saw it. Lacquered maple and rosin dust, old felt hammers and something faintly electrical. The ghost of 1,000 amplifiers left running too long. Vintage Steinways lined the back wall like altars. A Hammond B3 sat in the corner under a velvet cloth. Every instrument had a tag. Every tag had a number with a comma in it. At the far end, behind a frosted glass door, Leonard was pulling a case off the shelf. He set it on the velvet table and looked across at his guest. Quincy Jones, 3 weeks removed from watching Thriller become the best-selling album on the planet. He sat with his arms crossed, studying a Fender Rhodes Stage 73, a pre-production prototype sourced from a session player who had no idea what was sitting in his garage. Quincy had been in the room for 40 minutes. He wasn't in a hurry. Men like him rarely were. On the table beside the Rhodes, 2 sheets of paper, a condition report, a purchase contract. Quincy's pen was uncapped. That's when the front door opened. The man who walked in didn't announce himself. He never did anymore. Brown leather jacket, worn past the point of fashion. Dark slacks, slightly rumpled. A flat wool cap pulled low. No jewelry. Nothing that said, "Look at me." Most people in this city wouldn't have recognized him on the street. He moved along the wall slowly. He didn't touch anything. He'd stop in front of an instrument, study the keys, examine the action, tilt his head like he was listening to something inside the wood. In front of a vintage Wurlitzer, his right hand moved. Barely. His fingers opened in the air beside the keys, forming the shape of a chord over nothing. Held it. Released. 25 years of muscle memory, living in his hands whether anyone was watching or not. The 2 salespeople on the floor didn't look up. Derek was 28, slim gray suit, hair combed neat. He looked at the man in the wool cap. No watch. Scuffed shoes, jacket from another decade. Went back to his phone. Earl was in his late 50s. Ponytail gone gray, glasses thick as bottle glass, forearms covered in faded ink. 31 years in the business. He'd stopped trusting what a man was wearing a long time ago. He was watching the man's hands. Left hand, fingers 1 through 4. The calluses were specific, pressed deep from decades of sustained chord work, not weekend playing. The kind of marks that form when you don't just play piano, when you live inside it. Earl set down his clipboard. The man stopped in front of a Mark I Rhodes 73. He crouched to look at the key bed at eye level, tapped one key with his index finger. Not playing it, just feeling the resistance, checking what the action still had left in it. Then he looked toward the counter. "Excuse me." Quiet voice. Measured. A formality worn in from somewhere long ago. Derek looked up. "I'm looking at this Rhodes. Are these the original factory hammer tips, or has this been revoiced?" That is not a question a hobbyist asks. Derek heard it as noise. Glanced at the jacket again. "That's a collector's piece," he said. His smile was patient, practiced. The managing expectations smile. "We do carry newer models that might be a better starting point. There are some great shops down on Sunset that specialize in more accessible price ranges." The man looked at him. No anger, no surprise. Only the quiet, worn-in recognition of someone who had been having this exact conversation for most of his adult life. "I'm not looking for accessible," he said. Derek had already decided. "These instruments are kept for a specific buyer profile. I don't mean any offense, but..." He let the rest go. The implication was already in the room. Silence. The man gave a small nod and turned back to the Rhodes. He didn't walk out. He just turned back. Like the man behind the counter wasn't worth the energy it would take to be angry about. Earl stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Derek, look at his hands. Every retired musician has calluses, Earl. Hobbyists don't ask about factory hammer tips. Look at the left hand. Really look." Derek checked for half a second, shrugged, turned away. Earl stood there feeling the familiar weight of not being listened to. 31 years and it still didn't buy him much. He went back to his clipboard. Inside the VIP room, something changed. Quincy had the contract in his hand, pen ready. Then something at the edge of the showroom floor caught his eye. Not a sound, a shape. The way a man was standing in front of an instrument. That slight forward lean, the absolute stillness of someone listening to something inside the wood itself. He set the contract down. He stepped closer to the glass. The man had his back turned, but the way he was holding himself, Quincy had seen that posture in recording sessions. He'd watched those hands build chord progressions from the ground up, pulling harmonics out of silence like they'd been waiting there all along. He set his pen down on the table. He pushed open the frosted glass door. Leonard looked up. Derek straightened immediately. Even Earl raised his head. Quincy walked through the showroom without hurrying. Easy pace. He moved past Derek without looking at him, past the Steinways, past the Hammond still sleeping under its cloth. He stopped 6 feet behind the man in the wool cap. 3 seconds, reading the shoulders, reading the stillness. Then the man turned around. They looked at each other. Quincy's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. The immediate certain recognition that doesn't need confirmation. Marvin. One word, but there was something inside it. Relief, maybe. The relief of finding something you weren't sure still existed. Marvin looked at him, and for the first time since he'd walked through that door, something in his face came loose. Not a smile yet, just the beginning of one. The thawing of something that had been locked up for a long time. Q, almost to himself. Quincy looked at the Mark I beside them, then toward the counter. Get this plugged in. Nobody in particular, but Derek moved. Nobody spoke while the amp warmed up. Earl came around the counter and stood to the side. Leonard appeared at the VIP doorway. The customer at the register had placed his phone face down without realizing he'd done it. The amp hummed, settled. Marvin sat down. He didn't adjust the bench, didn't run scales, didn't do anything to buy himself a moment of confidence. He just sat, hands resting on his thighs, not touching the keys. Then he played. The first chord was quiet. 4 notes pressed with exactly the right weight. Not hard, not delicate, but present. The weight of something carried a long distance and set down gently. His left hand stayed there and let it breathe. His right hand found a melody, a single line, slow and unhurried. Notes that didn't announce themselves. They arrived, each one sitting in the air for a moment before making room for the next. Between every note, there was space. And that space was not empty. It was full of everything the notes didn't say. This was not a performance. There was no audience in his mind. This was a man talking to himself in the only language he'd ever fully trusted. The Rhodes sang the way it only does for someone who understands it. Warm, slightly imperfect. Like a voice that's been through something and doesn't pretend otherwise. Earl's knuckles went white on the counter's edge. He'd spent 31 years in this business. He'd stood in rooms with talented people. This was different. This was the thing itself. Present tense, 6 feet away, coming out of a man in a worn leather jacket who had just been pointed toward the shops on Sunset. His throat tightened. Derek had gone pale. Every assumption he'd made in 4 seconds had collapsed, and in its place was the specific expression of a man doing arithmetic that no longer adds up. Marvin played for 2 minutes, maybe 3. Time stopped being reliable. He let the last note ring until the room was quiet on its own. Then he lifted his hands off the keys and rested them in his lap. Nobody said anything. Quincy started clapping. Slow, deliberate, 1 beat every second. Leonard joined. Then Earl, who hadn't applauded anything in years, who clapped now because there was nothing else to do with what was sitting in his chest. Marvin sat still for a moment. Then he came back. He looked at Quincy. I came in for Bubby, he said. Quincy nodded. He already understood. Marvin's son was 10 years old. He'd started picking out melodies on the upright piano at his grandmother's house on Gramercy Place. The same house where Marvin was currently sleeping in his old childhood bedroom because the IRS and 2 divorce settlements had made everything else impossible. The boy had his father's hands. Everyone in the family said so. Marvin had missed a lot of things. He knew the list. Quincy walked to the counter. He didn't look at Derek. He looked at Leonard. We'll take the Mark I and whatever else he needs. Derek stayed where he was. He had nothing to do with his hands. Marvin stood from the bench. He noticed Derek looking. He didn't say anything. Just met his eyes for a moment. No heat, no satisfaction. The look of a man for whom this particular wound had scar tissue over it by now. Then he turned away. Near the front window, a small, second-hand, spinning keyboard sat on a stand. Nothing special, stripped down. Marvin pressed one key. Middle C held the pedal down and let it ring until it faded completely. He thought about his son's hands finding that note for the first time. He thought about being in the room when it happened. When they left, Earl stood at the window and watched the car until it turned off the block. Then he looked at the bench where Marvin had been sitting and stood there for a while. The way you stand somewhere after something happens that you know you'll carry a long time. 3 weeks later, Leonard taped a handwritten card above the entrance to the showroom floor. 5 words. What you see is not everything. He didn't explain it to anyone. Nobody asked. Derek stayed at Meridian for 2 more years. He got better. Slowly and painfully. The way people get better at things they were badly wrong about. One afternoon, Earl watched him crouch in front of a customer, an older man in a paint-stained jacket, and ask about his calluses. Ask which fingers. Ask how long. Earl said nothing. He just let the kid learn. That same winter, in a house on Gramercy Place, a 10-year-old boy sat down at a second-hand keyboard in the living room. His father pulled a chair beside him. Neither spoke for a moment, the way people go quiet right before something begins. Marvin put his left hand on the keys. His son watched those fingers. Hands he'd seen his whole life, holding a coffee cup, folded in his lap during long silences, turning slowly through the pages of a notebook late at night. He had never seen them do this. Marvin played one chord, held it, then looked at his son. Your turn. The boy pressed down. Wrong notes. Slow, uncertain. Marvin didn't correct him. He didn't show him the right way, didn't say anything at all. He just smiled and let the sound stay in the room. And for a little while, everything that had gone wrong and everything that hadn't happened didn't weigh quite as much as it usually did. Sometimes a chord is just a chord, and sometimes it's everything you never got to say, finally finding a way out. Have you ever been dismissed before someone truly saw what you were capable of? Tell us your story in the comments.